As the search for the missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 enters a second week, Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak now says investigators believe the plane's communication and tracking systems were deliberately disabled. But Mr. Najib says authorities cannot confirm the plane was taken over with force and they are still looking at all possibilities.
After meeting with family members of some of the 239 people on board MH370, Prime Minister Najib Razak announced a breakthrough in the search for the missing plane.
We can say with a high degree of certainty that the aircraft communications, addressing and reporting system, or ACUS, was disabled just before the aircraft reached the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. Shortly afterwards, near the border between Malaysia and Vietnamese air traffic control, the aircraft's transponder was switched off. From this point onwards, the Royal Malaysian Air Force primary radar data showed that an aircraft which was believed but not confirmed to be MH370 did indeed turn back. It then flew in a westerly direction back over Peninsular Malaysia before turning northwest.
He says new data indicates these were deliberate actions by someone on the plane, but stopped short of saying it was a hijacking.
Despite media reports that the plane was hijacked, I wish to be very clear. We are still investigating all possibilities as to what caused MH370 to deviate from its original flight path.
The last satellite communication with the Boeing 777 came at 8:11 a.m. on Saturday. That's more than 6.5 hours after it vanished from civilian radar at 1:30 a.m. on March 8th.
The aviation authorities of Malaysia and their international counterparts have determined that the plane's last communication with a satellite was in one of two possible corridors. A northern corridor stretching approximately from the border of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan to northern Thailand, or a southern corridor stretching approximately from Indonesia to southern Indian Ocean.
Mr. Najib says Malaysia is calling off the search in the South China Sea and is working with relevant countries to look into the new leads.
And shortly after Prime Minister Najib spoke, police headed to the home of the pilot of the missing MAS plane. Channel News Asia's Sumisha Naidu has this update.
The Prime Minister says the Malaysian government is refocusing its investigation on the passengers and crew of the plane. Now, we understand that authorities have gone to the pilot's home this afternoon. There's a high level of security outside the pilot's home. We understand that they had some suspicions because the pilot had an flight simulator in his home. But we've been told by the Department of Civil Aviation that many pilots have this and it's nothing out of the usual. But the Prime Minister says that the government still is investigating him and everyone else on the plane.
Relatives of some of the missing passengers have been camping out at the Everly Hotel in Putrajaya, and they say the new information on the plane, scant as it was, gave them heart.
Dulu kita tertanya-tanya dan hari ini sudah dapat maklumat yang boleh katakan sahih, mempunyai harapan yang cerah, ya, menemui pesawat dan para penumpang yang berada di dalam pesawat.
Well, China is demanding that Malaysia pull in more countries into the search for MH370. Two-thirds of the passengers on board are its citizens. Beijing says Malaysia must provide more thorough and accurate information.
时间呢，就是生命。我们要求马方呢，继续扩大并且明确搜寻的范围，加大搜寻的力度。
Channel News Asia's Christine Lim was with some 300 family members in Beijing watching the Malaysian Prime Minister's news conference, and she has more on their reactions.
Right, today is one of the most anxious moments in their wait over the past 8 days because they were told by the Malaysian ambassador to China there would be a new announcement. Many were looking tired, some hugging each other for support. And there was a slight commotion in the room when in the end there was still no answer on where the plane was. But the possibility of a hijack has reignited some hopes that their loved ones might still make it back. The Malaysia Airlines management told relatives here in Beijing that moving forward, new information on the search and investigation will be released by the Malaysian authorities, the government, and not the airline, because they're now starting to look into criminal investigations. But some families did not take this well.
为什么到现在才能发布出来这信息？因为这个网上这个信息很早以前就出来了。
就整个事件而言的话，我认为是个好消息，就是我们的亲人还是有生存的希望。
非常焦急，非常焦急。他的妈妈现在吃安眠药都睡不着了。
Well, the Indian Ocean is now one of the focal points of the search for the missing plane. Channel News Asia's India Bureau Chief gives us a sense of the area.
Over the area of Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. It's approximately 720 kilometers long and 52-kilometer wide stretch. The Andaman group of islands are about 572, but only 37 are inhabited. Rest is all forested area. The landing strip in Port Blair, the capital, is the only one that can accommodate a Boeing 777, and MH370 did not land here for certain. Military sources tell us that if the aircraft had flown anywhere near the Indian mainland or the Andaman Islands, their radars would have picked up signals.
Well, reports have also emerged that the plane climbed to above 40,000 feet before descending to below 30,000 feet. An aviation expert explains why these changes in altitude will be of particular interest to investigators.
Now, the interesting thing about the altitude numbers for me, there's two concepts. One is that at 45,000 feet, that's above the actual service ceiling of the aircraft. So hypothetically, what could be happening in the cockpit is you may be trying to fly above most air traffic that flies in the 30,000s range. Now, when you fly that high, the aircraft performance is degraded, and if you go too high, you'll lose lift under the wings, and the aircraft could, suddenly fall down and lose, 10, 15,000 feet pretty quickly. Now, flying at 29.5 thousand feet is an interesting altitude because most commercial aircraft only fly at even thousands. They'll fly at 30,000, 31,000, 32,000. Nobody will fly at 29,500 feet. So if you're flying at 29,500 feet, which is one of the altitudes that was reported, you might intentionally be trying to avoid other traffic that normally air traffic control would vector you around. So it's a kind of an awkward altitude. The other thing that's interesting about that is generally when aircraft fly west, they fly in even numbers. So 32,000, 34,000, 36,000. When they fly east, it's odd numbers, 31, 33, 35,000. So 29.5 thousand flying heading of west doesn't really make sense for a couple of reasons. So it's an interesting altitude and one that I think bears further investigation.
Well, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has expressed Singapore's deepest concern for the safety of the crew and passengers on board MH370 in letters to Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak and Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. In his letter to Prime Minister Najib, Mr. Lee said he's deeply saddened that MH370 remains missing and noted Singapore has deployed aircraft and ships to join in the search for the plane. He adds that Singapore stands ready to provide any further support that will help in this effort. In his letter to Premier Lee, Mr. Lee noted that several of the 150 Chinese nationals on board MH370 were reported to have been working or studying in Singapore. He says Singapore will continue to support ongoing efforts to find the aircraft as soon as possible. Singapore's Defence Ministry says following Malaysia's announcement, it has called off its search in the South China Sea, but it will continue the hunt for the missing plane in the Malacca Strait with one of its aircraft. MINDEF says it stands ready to provide further assistance to Malaysia.